So I broke my hip when I was 30 years old. I fell when I was skiing. When I hit the ground, I knew it was a hard shot. I felt it throughout my whole body, like, ugh, that really felt uncomfortable. And then I tried to stand up, and the pain all zoomed into my right hip. And that led to a rather rugged toboggan ride off of the mountain at Alta, Utah, a helicopter ride to the hospital, and the following day, a surgery to place hardware. So hey, I'm Dr. Topher Fox, Christopher Fox, and this video is the first of two parts really designed to help get you up to speed so we can have the most productive conversation possible when we visit, talking about you and your situation and your bone health. So I'm going to jump behind some slides here, if I can make this work just right, and yeah, show you some pictures as we go through, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. But this was my hip that very day that I told you about, and you can see where this is supposed to be a nice straight line here. There's a little raggedness, and shortly thereafter, my hip now looks like this. And I tell you this story just to give you my perspective, to say I developed a great respect for hip fracture. I was 30 years old when this happened, really fairly athletic and active, and it took me a full 7 months to be able to get back to running after this injury. And so I can only imagine what this must be like to happen in the 60s or 70s. And so today what I want to do is, again, help to make our conversation really helpful and high level. We have a limited amount of time together, unfortunately, and through this and through collecting some data ahead of time, I want to be able to really spend the most time when we meet at the highest level possible. So let's just dive through some of these basics here. This is, as I mentioned, the first of two parts. Look for a link up there or down there, and you can catch part two if you are interested in doing that before your first visit. Let me scoop myself over here. And so what we're going to talk about today is what is osteoporosis. We're going to go through some basic bone physiology, talk about the evaluation of fracture risk, and the evaluation of bone metabolism. And then in part two, we're really going to focus in on treatment and prevention. How can you treat and prevent fractures from occurring? All the options so that you can make the best choice for you about what's right for you. And so let's talk about what is osteoporosis. Just from a definition standpoint, osteoporosis is a decrease in the quantity of bone or the quality of the bone, or both, that predisposes you to have fractures, specifically fractures that wouldn't occur in a normal person who had healthy bones. Often we talk about energy equal to or less than the fall from a standing height, but I think it's easier just to think about fractures that wouldn't have occurred if your bones were healthy. We call those fragility fractures, and our goal is to prevent them. The whole reason that we do bone density testing, that we do evaluation of risk, is we want to know, we want to prevent these fragility fractures from occurring. We want to know what's the right thing to do for each person to keep these from happening. And it's been my experience that, really a majority of people really would love to be able to come in and just hear, hey, you're going to be totally fine, no worries, and you don't need medication, everything's going to be great. And for some of you, that will be the case. For others, it's going to be hard to be able to say that. So we want you to understand really your particular situation and what would be best for you. So, Golden Gate Bridge. Why do I show the Golden Gate Bridge? I lived just north of here when I was a kid. One of my friends growing up, his dad was actually superintendent of the Golden Gate Bridge. And little interesting fact, if you look right here, you can see some kind of a mechanical device that is most likely related to these people who never stop painting this bridge. The bridge is being continuously painted all the time. They paint it, and then when they're done painting it, they start over and they paint it again. And specifically, they will sandblast paint off. They sandblast the paint off, removing the old paint, and then layering on new paint. Heaven forbid that I would be this guy way up above the road here, putting paint on the bridge. Heaven forbid that was me. I would not like that job. But they layer the paint back on rather thick. I want to say it was 13 millimeters, or roughly ½ inch of paint. But this process really serves as a nice model for what happens inside your bone, because maybe a little counterintuitive, but your bone is actually alive. Bone is always being broken down and rebuilt. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So this is a science-y slide looking at the bone, just to say that inside the bone, we have these cells called osteoclasts that come from the blood. These osteoclasts will come in and they will chew out some of that old bone, creating a pit. So they kind of march down, they chew out the old bone, and then you have these other cells called osteoblasts that come from stem cells that will come in and lay down new bone. So it's kind of like removing the paint and then putting the paint back on. We call this process bone turnover, and it consists of the bone resorption or breaking down and the bone formation or building back up. And when we get into treatment, this will be important because we have treatments that target one side or the other side. But just wanted to give you that general picture of bone metabolism, and to say that for all of us till we're about 30 years old, we actually gradually increase our bone density. We build or form more than we break down. But after about age 30, that actually starts to go down. And every time we go through one of these cycles of breakdown and build up, we end up putting back just a little bit less. We lose bone. That accelerates a little bit through menopause, which means that if we live long enough, typically our bone density will drop to where we can reach this fracture threshold. We can have fractures where if our bones were totally healthy, we would not. So let's see some pictures of that. When we talk about bone, we can talk about two types of bone. The bone on the edge is this thick cortical bone. This might be a picture of a knee bone. We can see the thick cortical bone on the edge, kind of like the edge of a can. And then on the inside, we have all these little connecting pieces that add structure. Now let's take a look at how this changes as we get older. This is a view of bone quality. Looking at a 54-year-old, you can see these connections, how a lot of them are kind of thick and look like plates. And then a 74-year-old, and you'll notice that they've lost some of that plate-like structure, which is really strong, it turns out, from an engineering standpoint. They've lost some of these more plate-like structures, and a lot of them are more thin, kind of like a pencil. And if you notice, you can see that many of them have actually broken. Here are some that are no longer connected, and that decreases the structural integrity of the bone. Imagine pushing your finger through these bones. It would be much easier to poke your finger through this bone over here on the right than it would the bone on the left. So we want to help you and me, help all of us maintain bone that looks more like this bone over on this side. Okay, so diagnosis of osteoporosis. We'll just throw out a couple terms. First, to say that you can be diagnosed with osteoporosis even if your bone density is not in the osteoporosis range. Specifically, if you have had a fragility fracture, a fracture that would not occur in somebody with healthy bones, you know, you're standing at the kitchen sink and you turn and you snap your hip. That's not supposed to be happening. That will get you a diagnosis of osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is often diagnosed on the basis of bone density using this thing called a T-score, which compares your bones to that of a 30-year-old healthy person. And we know that osteoporosis, or I'll tell you that osteoporosis occurs when the T-score is at a number of minus 2.5 or below. So minus 2.5, minus 2.6, minus 2.8, minus 3, moving in that direction. We can also diagnose osteoporosis, and this is semantics, or we can say that you have osteopenia with a high fracture risk if the T-score is between minus 1 and minus 2.5, but the fracture risk is calculated to be elevated. We'll talk about this thing called the FRAX score in just a moment. So when I meet somebody with osteoporosis or with osteopenia or concerns about bone health, when you and I meet, this is the series of questions that often I will run through as we are together. What is your fracture risk? Can we estimate that? Is there anything that is going on right now that we need to know about that's damaging your bone health? Something that is a treatable or reversible condition that if we fix that, bone density will get better, or at least it will stop getting worse. And what is the best option for prevention of fractures or treatment of fractures if those have already occurred? This may be simply lifestyle. This may include medication, and we'll talk through that. And then finally, I do want to know about your treatment preferences. Ultimately, it's your body, and you get to decide what goes in there. I just want to be a good advisor for you. So when we talk about treatment, the idea of no treatment options, right? If I tell you that I think you would benefit from medication and you say, thank you, I'm not ready for that yet, well, we can move forward together and I can respect that. I just want you to have all the information to make a good decision, the best decision for you. So when we talk about evaluating fracture risk, really we want to know, have you had any previous fragility fractures? So I'll ask you about fractures, or on our history form, you'll see that it will ask you about fractures. I want to know if either of your parents broke a hip, because it turns out that's actually a pretty big risk factor for you. I do want to know your bone density if you've had that test. We could look at bone quality, which is often reported on modern bone density tests. And we will use that to calculate something called a FRAX score. FRAX was developed by the World Health Organization. It stands for Fracture Risk Assessment Tool. Don't ask me where the X came from. Fracture Risk Assessment Tool. And by plugging in your age and your height and your weight and some risk factors and your bone density, we can calculate a number, actually two numbers, your 10-year risk of hip fracture. In this example, this person is at a 4.8%. Anything above 3% is considered high and potentially worthy of consideration of osteoporosis medication, or the risk of major osteoporotic fracture, which includes hip fracture, spine fracture, upper arm fracture, pelvis fracture, wrist fracture. And in this example, 24%, anything above 20 is considered high. So we can use this to help understand your fracture risk. We'll try to put all of that together. We also want to do evaluation in the laboratory to help understand why you have low bone mass, why the bone density is low. And so this will include things that often look like vitamin D or parathyroid testing, thyroid testing, potentially testing for a condition called celiac disease. There's a bone cancerous condition called myeloma that's fairly uncommon but can cause osteoporosis. Often we will screen for that in the right type of person. I like to look at your calcium absorption, so I will apologize in advance that if you haven't done it already, almost certainly I will ask you to collect your urine for a full 24 hours. And this will help me to understand how well you're absorbing calcium and if your kidneys might be leaking calcium. Now, additionally, we might also do some testing to look at bone turnover, which is, can we assess how quickly that bone is being broken down and rebuilt? This is controversial whether it's useful, but I've been relying on it more and more, both to have a benchmark so we can see how you respond to treatment, should we decide to start something. Also because bone turnover, particularly in postmenopausal women, may help to understand fracture risk. So I'm going to wrap up for this part one. Again, there is a part two. So we've gone through what is osteoporosis, some basic physiology, kind of how I think about fracture risk and bone metabolism. And in part two, I'm going to talk about specific treatment options that are available for you, both in terms of lifestyle, things that you can do that don't involve prescriptions, as well as prescription medications and some of the risks and side effects that sometimes scare people away, or that we need to be cognizant of, that we need to be aware of in order to help you make the best decision for you. So let me wrap up. I will encourage you to make sure that you get your two history forms done, consent and demographics form, and most important for me is the medical history form. My staff can get you pointed in the right direction if you have no idea what I'm talking about, but I do want to see you get those in before we meet together. So wrapping up for part one, Dr. Topher Fox, Christopher Fox, signing out, wishing you peace. Take care.